The morning air in London was grey and still, a typical October hush lingering over the city. Sophie Hartwell stood in front of her window, watching raindrops trace slow, crooked paths down the glass. Her suitcase waited by the door, neatly packed, too neat, the kind of meticulous order someone only creates when their inner world feels like chaos. Her flat was silent, save for the ticking of the antique clock her grandmother had left her. The silence didn't soothe her. It echoed. After 5 months of solitude, after a fiancé who vanished with barely a goodbye and a future she had spent years building, Sophie had become intimately acquainted with loneliness. She stared at her hands, ink-stained fingers. She hadn't drawn in weeks, months, really. Her work, botanical illustrations for journals, museums, sometimes collectors, had always brought her calm. But now, even sketching felt like reaching for something she couldn't. Touch. The sudden ring of her phone broke the quiet. "Don't cancel," said Claire's voice on the other end, firm and knowing. "Don't you dare call the airline. You promised me you'd go." Sophie gave a dry smile. "I wasn't going to." "Yes, you were. I know you, and I booked that residency for a reason. Vermont is beautiful this time of year. Quiet, safe. Perfect for drawing again. I don't think a change of trees will fix." "It's not about the trees. It's about letting go of a place that stopped being good for you." Claire paused, softer now. "Give yourself the chance to fall in love with something new, even if it's just silence." Sophie didn't reply right away. She looked at the rain, still coming down, steady and stubborn. She boarded the flight that evening. The plane lifted into a sky bruised with purple clouds. As the lights of London dimmed below, Sophie rested her head against the window and let her eyes close, not quite asleep, not quite ready to be awake. She dreamed of colors she hadn't used in months: fiery reds, golden yellows, and deep maple browns. She didn't know yet that those colors would soon surround her, nor that they would change everything. The first thing Sophie noticed as the taxi wound its way through the Vermont countryside was the color. She'd seen autumn before, in bits, in parks, through the edges of cities, but not like this. Here, the trees burned in brilliant defiance of winter. Scarlet, amber, rust, gold. A riot of leaves cascading through the air as if the sky itself had shed its skin. It was overwhelming, and strangely, a little comforting. The car turned down a gravel road that creaked beneath the tires. Fences, lined with faded pumpkins and ivy, passed by her window. Far off, behind a field of hay and rows of gnarled apple trees, stood a large, weathered farmhouse and a guest house that looked like it had grown right out of the earth. Slate roof, wood beams, a wraparound porch framed by sugar maples ablaze with orange. A wooden sign swung in the breeze: Maple Glen Orchards. The driver stopped just beyond a cluster of apple crates stacked near the barn. "You're here," he said, glancing back. Sophie stepped out into cool, clean air, scented with apples and damp leaves. Her boots crunched over gravel as she took in the place. It was quiet, unnervingly so, and then footsteps. Measured, solid. A tall man emerged from around the barn carrying a basket of apples. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in worn jeans, flannel, and a thick wool vest. A few days' worth of scruff shadowed his jaw, and his expression was unreadable. Polite, distant. "You must be Sophie Hartwell," he said. His voice was soft, deep, tinged with a New England drawl. "I am. And you must be—" "Ethan Mercer," he said, setting the basket down. "The one who'll be making sure the roof doesn't leak over your head." She smiled, unsure if it was a joke. "Thanks for having me. It's just the guest house. My daughter and I live in the main house. You'll have plenty of space." Picked up her suitcase with ease and started walking toward the guest house. Sophie followed, admiring the surrounding orchard, rows of trees with low-hanging fruit, their branches heavy with the season's last bounty. The guest house was small, but charming. Inside, it smelled of cedar and cinnamon. A fireplace sat beneath a wooden mantel lined with dried herbs and miniature pumpkins. A large desk looked out over the orchard, and next to it, a stack of fresh, blank sketchbooks. She turned to Ethan, surprised. I asked Claire what you liked, he said simply. She said you hadn't been drawing much, thought it might help. Sophie didn't know what to say. I'll let you settle in, he added. Dinner's at 6 if you're hungry. And then, just like that, he was gone. She walked to the window and looked out at the orchard. The sky was beginning to deepen, shades of tangerine melting into dusky blue. Somewhere in the trees, wind chimes whispered. It was still, and for the first time in months, so was she. By the time Sophie made her way to the main house that evening, the sky had turned navy, and 1,000 stars blinked to life above the orchard. The gravel path crackled under her boots as she followed the flickering lanterns Ethan had placed along the edge. She hesitated at the front door, then knocked softly. It swung open almost immediately. Standing there was a young girl with wide gray eyes and a mess of dark curls tumbling over her shoulders. She looked about 9, wearing a flannel shirt too big for her and mismatched socks. You're the artist, she said, matter of fact. Sophie blinked. I suppose I am. I'm Hannah. The girl stepped aside, allowing her in with surprising authority. We're having stew. It's not bad. Dad's better at cider. Inside, the house was warm, a contrast to the crisp air outside. The scent of slow-cooked vegetables, thyme, and baking bread hung in the air like a welcome hug. A fire snapped, softly in the hearth, casting flickering light across shelves filled with books, photographs, and worn leather armchairs. Ethan appeared from the kitchen carrying a pot. Sophie, good timing. Hungry? She nodded. Starving, actually. Dinner was eaten at a long wooden table, mismatched chairs pulled in from various rooms. It was quiet at first, with the clink of spoons and the low hum of the fire. Then Hannah started asking questions. Do you draw people or just plants? Where are you from? England, right? Do you talk to the Queen? Do you ever make things up in your drawings like fairies? Sophie, amused and flustered, answered them all, with growing ease. She couldn't help but smile at the girl's energy. Ethan, meanwhile, mostly listened, occasionally interjecting with a quiet warning. Let Sophie breathe, bug. After dinner, Hannah offered to show Sophie the cool spot, a nook near the stairs filled with books and pillows. She pulled out a worn sketchbook. My mom used to draw too, Hannah said suddenly. Her tone dropped, as if her voice remembered something her mouth wasn't ready to say. Not like you. She liked cartoons and dragons. Sophie paused. Did she teach you? Sort of. She got sick when I was little. Hannah flipped a page quickly, then looked up. Do you miss anyone? Sophie blinked. The question landed, harder than she expected. Yes, she whispered. I do. They sat quietly for a moment, the fire casting shadows on the walls. Later, as Sophie returned to the guest house, the stars above seemed to stretch forever, endless and cold and beautiful. And yet something in her chest felt warmer than it had in a long time. She thought of Hannah's bold curiosity, Ethan's quiet care, and the soft weight of being known, even a little, by strangers. Perhaps, she thought, this place might heal more than just her art. Morning mist rolled over the orchard like breath, soft and slow, blurring the edges of the trees and the hills beyond. Sophie stepped outside with her sketchbook in hand, her fingers tingling from the crisp air, her heart oddly light. It had been months since she'd woken up with purpose. The trees wore their October coats proudly, leaves like fire, apples plump with sweetness. The only sound was the occasional call of crows and the crunch of her boots over fallen foliage. She found a spot beneath an old sugar maple, its branches stretched wide like open arms. There, with the trunk at her back and the orchard spread, before her like a painted sea, Sophie began to draw. First the leaves, veins curling like delicate lace. Then the way the sunlight broke through their canopy, spotlighting the fallen apples in warm gold. She lost track of time as pencil moved to page, detail after detail blooming beneath her fingers. It wasn't until a shadow passed over her page that she looked up. Ethan stood nearby, arms crossed, a mug of coffee in one hand. You've been out here a while, he said. Didn't want to startle you, she smiled, stretching. I didn't even notice. It's beautiful out here. He nodded, stepping closer. That tree you're under, planted by my grandfather. It's the oldest on the property. Glanced up. No wonder it feels strong, solid. You draw like you've been here longer than 2 days. It's the quiet. I can hear myself think here. She hesitated, then added, That hasn't happened in a long time. He nodded again but didn't press. He seemed to understand that silence wasn't emptiness, but space. And he gave her room to fill it herself. Later that day, Hannah found her still sketching. The little girl plopped onto the grass beside her with 2 apples and a book of fairy tales. I brought you snacks, she announced. Also, this story has a tree that talks. You should draw that. Sophie laughed. Maybe I will. Hannah peered over her sketchbook. You made the trees look like they're dancing. Maybe they are, Sophie said softly. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, Sophie felt a warmth she hadn't expected, not just from the orchard's golden light or the cider Hannah made her try, but from something more subtle, connection, to this place, to these people, to herself. And when she returned to the guest house that evening and laid her pages out across the desk, it wasn't just the orchard she had captured, it was peace. The wind picked up just after sundown. What had been a crisp, calm October day gave way to a sudden evening storm. Trees bent in the wind's howl, and raindrops splattered against the windows in rhythmic bursts. Inside the guest house, Sophie sat at her desk, sketching by the amber glow of her desk lamp. And then, darkness. The power snapped off with a soft, defeated click. The hum of the heater died. Her lamp flickered out. For a moment, there was only the storm. A knock on the door pulled her from her stillness. Ethan stood there, holding 2 flashlights and a lantern. Transformer's probably out, he said, voice calm despite the wind whipping behind him. Thought you might want some backup light. She took the lantern with a grateful nod. Thank you. I was about to make friends with the dark. You're welcome to wait it out in the main house, he offered after a moment. It's warmer. And we've got tea, assuming the kettle hasn't mutinied. Sophie hesitated only a second before grabbing her sweater. Inside the main house, it felt like stepping into a simpler time. The fireplace roared to life in the living room, casting flickering light across walls lined with books and family photos. Hannah was curled up under a blanket, nose buried in a worn copy of The Secret Garden. Night, Sophie, she said sleepily, already dozing. Ethan poured hot water from an old-fashioned kettle into 2 mugs. They sat near the fire, quiet at first, sipping spiced herbal tea. Rain tapped the windows like an anxious guest. Sophie broke the silence. She's bright and curious. She's everything good I ever did, Ethan said quietly. There was a pause, heavy but unforced. My sister mentioned, Your wife? She asked gently. Ethan stared into the fire for a long moment. Her name was Marin. We met at college. She was wild in the best way, laughed too loud, danced barefoot in parking lots. He smiled faintly. Cancer. 3 years ago this winter. Sophie swallowed. I'm sorry. He nodded once but didn't look away from the flames. I didn't think I'd come back here to the orchard, but Hannah needed something steady, and maybe I did too. Sophie took a long breath. Her voice was soft when she finally said, I was engaged. He left. Quietly, no scandal, no explanation, just disappeared one morning. Ethan turned to her, eyes shadowed but open. People assume grief is only for the dead, but sometimes it's for the living who let you go. She didn't realize her hands were shaking until he set his mug down and reached for them. His hands were warm, solid. He didn't speak, just held hers for a long time. Outside, the storm still rattled the eaves. But inside, something else had shifted. 2 people, both broken, both brave in quiet ways, had shared their stories. And in the fire's glow, they had found something close to comfort. The storm had passed by morning, leaving a glittering sheen of dew on every leaf and apple in the orchard. The air was sharper now, edged with November's breath, and the sky was a pale, clean blue, the kind that stretches endlessly over fields and barns and dreams long buried. Sophie awoke early, energized by something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe the warmth from the night before still lingered in her chest. Maybe it was the way Ethan had held her hands, gently, like they mattered. She dressed in layers and boots, grabbed her sketchbook, and made her way to the barn where Ethan and Hannah were already sorting apples. Hannah grinned when she saw her. "We're making cider today. You get to help." "I've never made cider," Sophie confessed. "You don't need to know how," Ethan said, handing her a basket. "You just need to carry apples and not fall into the press." Together, they worked, laughing, learning, and slipping into an easy rhythm. Sophie discovered how satisfying it was to roll apples into wooden crates, to feel the sun on her back and the crisp tang of fruit-scented air in her lungs. At one point, she stopped to sketch the cider press, its rusted iron arms and the way the golden liquid trickled down into wooden barrels. Ethan watched her quietly, then looked away when she glanced up. She was starting to notice that he only stared when he thought she wouldn't catch him. Later, as the sun sank low, Ethan lit a fire pit behind the barn. They sat wrapped in blankets, mugs of hot cider warming their hands. Hannah had gone inside for her bedtime reading, leaving the two of them in a bubble of starlight and silence. "You're starting to look like you belong here," Ethan said. Sophie smiled, sipping slowly. "Maybe I do." "Do you miss the city?" She thought about the rain-slicked streets, the weight of her old apartment, the ghost of a man who no longer haunted her. "No," she said honestly. "I don't think I do." The fire crackled. The Beowulf's sky spilled stars, and then, quietly, hesitantly, Ethan reached out and brushed a stray leaf from her hair. His hand lingered for a breath longer than necessary. She didn't move away. No words passed between them after that, but something unspoken settled between their shoulders, fragile and glowing, like the first flicker of flame in dry wood. Sophie didn't know what came next, but she knew this. She was no longer merely visiting. She was beginning to stay. The orchard had quieted with the change of the season. The trees were barer now, their branches like reaching fingers against a gray sky. A sense of stillness had settled over Maple Glen, the kind that came with waiting. The harvest was done. The tourists were gone. Winter whispered at the edges of every morning. Sophie spent her days drawing, walking, baking with Hannah, and, more often than not, finding excuses to end up near Ethan. They didn't talk about that night by the fire. They didn't need to. It was there, between them, in the way he always made her coffee exactly how she liked it, in the way she remembered to bring him extra gloves when the wind picked up. It lived in the spaces between conversation, in glances that said more than words, and, yet, Sophie still felt something tugging at her from behind. One cold afternoon, with frost lining the edges of her studio windows, she opened her suitcase and pulled out a small, battered envelope. It was addressed to Nathaniel Hart, never mailed, her ex-fiancé, the man who had left her without a goodbye. She sat at her desk for a long while staring at the envelope. Then she opened her journal, not the sketchbook but the one she kept locked tight, and began to write. Not for him, but for herself. "You left. And for months I thought it was because I was too much or not enough. You didn't give me answers. You gave me silence. But silence isn't peace. It's a cage." Her words spilled out in ink and tears. It wasn't about blame. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about the version of herself she had abandoned in the wake of his leaving. When she was done, she folded the letter, tucked it into the envelope, and sealed it. But she didn't mail it. Instead, she walked to the edge of the orchard, to the oldest tree, Ethan's grandfather's tree, and buried the envelope beneath a pile of leaves and stone. Letting go didn't always look like closure. Sometimes it looked like choosing not to carry something anymore. As she stood there, hands in her coat pockets, she heard quiet footsteps behind her. Ethan. He didn't ask what she was doing. He just stood beside her, silent, present. And in that stillness, Sophie realized something. She was no longer mourning what had been lost. She was making space for what might still be found. The first snow arrived overnight, soft and silent. Sophie woke to a world blanketed in white. Outside her guest house window, the orchard had transformed. Branches kissed with snow, rooftops dusted like powdered sugar. Even the sky seemed quieter, wrapped in pale morning light. She stood at the window in thick socks and a sweater, holding a mug of tea, and simply breathed it in. It felt like a beginning. By mid-morning, Hannah had burst in with her red boots and a knit scarf that trailed behind her like a cape. "You have to come outside. It's perfect snowman snow." Sophie bundled up, laughing as Hannah pulled her out into the yard. Ethan joined them a few minutes later, holding carrots and a bucket of buttons. There was no talk of adult things, just rolling snowballs, shaping lumpy torsos, and arguing over whether their snowman needed a top hat or a beanie. The laughter came easily, like it belonged. Later, inside, while Hannah read by the fire, Ethan brewed hot cocoa the old-fashioned way, dark, rich, with a hint of cinnamon. Sophie sat at the kitchen counter, warming her hands on the mug. "I don't remember the last time I laughed like that," she said softly. "You should do it more often," Ethan replied, leaning against the stove. There was a pause. Something, unsaid, flickered between them. Then Sophie spoke again. "Would it be strange if I said, 'I don't want to leave yet'?" He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "No," he said finally. "It wouldn't be strange at all." Her heart fluttered, not with fear but with quiet wonder. That evening, Sophie returned to her guest house to find something tucked between her sketchbooks. A single red apple, polished to a shine, with a note tied around the stem. For the artist who sees more than trees. E. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the apple like it was made of glass. For a moment she thought of fairy tales, of enchanted fruits, and new chapters and choices. But this wasn't magic. This was something slower, something real. She smiled to herself, peeled off her gloves, and began to draw again. Not just the orchard, not just the snow, she drew him, and with every line she realized she was no longer sketching a stranger, she was sketching the shape of something she hadn't known she was missing. The snow had stopped, but the hush it left behind still lingered. Days moved more slowly now, as if even time had been lulled into a winter rhythm. Sophie's drawings were changing. What had started as landscapes and orchard sketches had shifted, subtly at first, into scenes of connection. A hand reaching for another, boots side by side on a porch. A man, half-turned, his expression caught between memory and hope. She wasn't drawing for distraction anymore. She was drawing what she felt. And one morning, as she flipped through her sketchbook with the wood stove crackling nearby, Ethan knocked gently on the guest house door. "I wanted to show you something." She followed him up the path to the barn. Inside, the scent of cedar and dust met her like a forgotten memory. He led her past shelves of old tools and crates, to a corner she hadn't noticed before. There, under a sheet, was something large, almost hidden. He pulled back the cover. It was a wooden easel. Worn, but beautifully crafted. The kind that once belonged to someone who knew what creation meant. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She painted until her arthritis made it impossible. She used to say art was how she remembered, the things her memory lost." Sophie stepped closer, running her hand along the grain. "It's beautiful. I thought, maybe you'd like to use it," Ethan said. "It's been sitting here too long." She looked up, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. "I'd love to." They stood in silence for a moment, the space around them filled with old wood, old stories, and something unspoken swelling between their ribs. Before they left the barn, Ethan paused. "There's something else," he said. "Hannah's school is hosting a winter fair next weekend. Crafts, cocoa, music. She really wants you to come." Sophie smiled. "I'd like that." Ethan nodded, looking down, then back up. "She also might have told her teacher you're an artist and volunteered you for the cookie booth banner." Sophie laughed. "Of course she did." The invitation hung in the air like something larger than a school fair. It wasn't just about showing up for cookies and children's choirs. It was about letting herself be seen, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. That night, as snow drifted outside and firelight flickered across the guest house walls, Sophie sketched again, not for the gallery, not for anyone else, just for the joy of it. And when she finished, she didn't put the sketch away. She left it on the easel Ethan had given her. A woman wrapped in a scarf standing in an orchard, looking towards something unseen, but waiting. Maple Glen Elementary was a modest brick building that wore its holiday spirit proudly. Hand-cut. Snowflakes hung in the windows, and the air outside smelled of pine garlands and cinnamon. Sophie arrived early with Ethan and Hannah, who practically skipped into the building in her puffy coat and glittery earmuffs. The school gymnasium had been transformed. String lights draped from the ceiling, booths lined with handmade crafts, and tables stacked with cookies, candles, and knitted scarves. Sophie stood behind the cookie booth, adjusting the hand-painted banner she'd finished just that morning. It featured a cheerful snowman holding a platter of cookies with swirling script that read, "Sweet treats and sweeter smiles." "You made that?" asked a woman beside her, clearly impressed. Sophie smiled. "Yes, with some help from your head of promotions." She nodded toward Hannah, who was currently convincing a teacher to buy gingerbread. "She talks about you all the time," the woman said warmly. "Says you make the orchard feel like it's full of magic." Sophie's cheeks flushed. Later, she wandered the fair with Ethan. Children sang carols off-key. A brass band fumbled through Jingle Bells. They shared cider again, this time from paper cups, and watched Hannah perform a short skit dressed as a snowflake. "She was so nervous," Ethan said, beaming. "I'm proud of her." "You've done a beautiful job with her," Sophie said quietly. "She's bright, kind, creative. She's a reflection of you." Ethan looked at her for a long time, his expression shifting. "Sophie," he said gently, "I know we've both been walking carefully, for good reason. But I need you to know. This, us, I feel it, and not just in passing." Her breath caught. The fair noise seemed to soften around them. "I feel it too," she whispered. Neither of them made a grand gesture. There was no kiss. No dramatic moment, but he reached for her hand, and she let him. They spent the rest of the evening like that, fingers laced, surrounded by children's laughter, the scent of cinnamon, and something new blooming quietly beneath the glow of winter lights. That night, back at the guest house, Sophie lit a candle beside her sketch pad. She opened to a fresh page, and she didn't hesitate. She began to draw them, not as they were in a single moment, but as she saw them now. Two people, learning how to love again, in the middle of an orchard and a winter fair and the wild beauty of second chances.